Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter from my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story. And I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who write such complimentary messages below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, when I was 11 years old, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. Last time we were staying with this dreary old great aunt. In fact, behind my mother's back, or our mother's back, we used to call her Dreary Mary. She had no sense of humour. She was just a lady who'd been married to a viscount or a duke or something. We didn't care. But it was very important to Mum that she had a titled great aunt. In fact, she had two titled great aunts. One of her other aunts had married Lord Stanley, so she was Lady Stanley. And oh boy, were we allowed to forget that? No. So there had been talk of the two creepy sisters taking me out for a ride on one of their spare hunters, a prospect which was really exciting to me. They'd even told me that the hunting season had already started and that there was a good chance that I could participate, something I'd longed to do all my life. But it was all talk. Instead, the two middle-aged spinsters locked themselves away in their own self-contained quarters. Both of them were swallowed up somewhere on the third floor above me, and all I ever heard of them was the faint sound of the younger one's television set through the high ceiling of my vast bedroom. They never joined us for meals, so I didn't see them at all during my fortnight there. I felt a bit peeved at this treatment. After all, I'd given up a week of my own time back at home to make their stay with Mum on the farm as pleasant as possible, and had taken a lot of trouble to make sure they'd enjoyed all the best rides on the polo ponies. Now the least they could do was invite me upstairs to watch television. But since my aunt didn't believe in having a set in her part of the house, I would have liked nothing better than to sit in front of some British television. But instead, I was forced to choose between trailing after my great aunt while she meandered around the enormous walled-in vegetable garden, taking forever to select this piece of broccoli or that, interspersed with a bit of weeding here and there, all of which was stultifyingly boring. Or I could spend the day with her husband, the old lecher, and his port, which sounded better than it actually was, since in between his noisy lavatorial occupation, he took every opportunity to sit far too close to me and paw at my knee with his wizened old claw-like hands. So I lay on my bed under the counterpane. What the devil is a counterpane? We know them as duvets. Counterpane? Anyway, that's me just having a little rant. Upstairs, reading the books I'd found in the well-stocked library downstairs, and tried to pass the time. After that interminably dull visit to Great Aunt Mary, Lady Byng, just to appease my snobbish mother, showing off her titled background, I'd been dropped off by taxi back at the Barnbys to a very warm welcome. I was given a pretty and extremely comfortable spare room to myself and was reintroduced to the family. Henry was a second cousin of Dad's. I know I've told you all this before, but it's worth repeating. Henry was a second cousin of Dad's and was so utterly different from him that you wouldn't believe they were even remotely related. Audrey was his wife, and Miles, who is exactly my age, also Frances, his younger sister, who was 15. I felt immediately back at home with them, comfortably back at home with them, and they told me to repack my case for Ireland, as we were leaving the next day to spend 3 weeks in Henry's house on the coast of Baltimore. I had to ring Dad to ask him if I could write a cheque for £90 to pay for my plane ticket. Dad was extremely generous, most unlike him, and added a bit of spending money to my allowance so that I could get a few more suitable articles of clothing for a seaside holiday. It was with great excitement that I left with my Uncle Henry and his family early the next morning to catch our little Aer Lingus plane to Cork. The bright greens surrounding the small Cork airport, truly an emerald green, came into view as we circled and flew into land. "Look," said Miles, and pointed to a man with a shepherd's crook and a border collie who was busy chasing a straggle of sheep that had wandered off the rich grazing on the edge of the airstrip and were about to blunder into the path of our plane as it touched down. "That always happens," laughed Miles. "The Irish have never got around to fencing off the area around the runway, as I suppose it's cheaper to employ a shepherd to keep the sheep off." Henry had hired a red Fiat at the airport and drove us down to Baltimore, and from the back seat I gazed at all the bright green fields, each surrounded by dry stone walls, while the roads, more like lanes, had thick, high hedgerow on either side. There were scarlet poppies flowering at that time of the year, among white daisies and so many other pretty and many-coloured, but unknown to me anyway, wild flowers. The countryside was pretty in a chocolate box way, which I found enchantingly new and yet again so familiar. I had a distinct sense of déjà vu so much of the time. It felt a little odd. I was getting to know Miles again after a gap of about 3 years. When Miles was about 15, Henry had brought his family out for a holiday in South Africa and stayed at New Forest, our cattle ranch. Henry had been born in Durban and took his family to live in England when Miles was 4. Henry occasionally came back for business reasons, as he was one of the directors and a major shareholder in W.G. Brown and Co. And it was Dad's shares from the firm that were effectively paying for all my skiing and now a holiday in the UK. Miles and I had had the greatest fun together. It was such a treat to have a boy of my own age for company, especially as he was English and everything was new and strange to him. I showed him all my haunts in the bush and the river, and he joined me exploring the ranch with my Zulu friends. It was like having a brother of the same age, except that everything was totally new to him, especially the snakes, spiders, and other strange insects we came across, all of which made him extremely nervous, especially as I couldn't restrain myself from exaggerating to the highest degree the danger of being either bitten or stung by all of them. Even the songololos, those fat millipedes that were and are abundant and to be found crawling along everywhere, including the walls, up the walls inside the house. Admittedly, they did look quite scary, especially if one poked them with a stick, whereupon they'd roll into a flat spring-like coil, excreting a toxic acid which repels predators. This disgusting yellow stuff gives off an awful smell that is really difficult to remove from your hands. I couldn't inveigle Miles into riding, although, even when I'd offered him old Ronald, Dad's aging and most bomb-proof polo pony, he politely declined, saying he'd not ridden much before. The village of Baltimore is at the southernmost tip of County Cork, about a mile and a half down a narrow lane hedged by scarlet fuchsia, which was blooming in profusion, each hedge heavily festooned and drooping from the weight of so many minute, dainty little red flowers. Ballylinchy overlooked the Roscarbery 100 Isles estuary. It was an old double-storey farmhouse of whitewashed stone, perched on a hill in grounds of about 4 acres, and had 3 big bedrooms upstairs. There was a big stone barn outside, which had been converted into bachelors' quarters for any young men who might be visiting, as the Barnbys always liked to invite several guests along whenever they took a holiday at Ballylinchy. I had a bedroom to myself, as did Francis, while Henry and Audrey shared the main ensuite bedroom, with views almost to Cape Clear Island, beyond which stands the Fastnet Lighthouse on its small rock of an island in the Atlantic Ocean, and is the most southerly point of Ireland. Henry always threw himself wholeheartedly into Irish habits when he was there, and, quite unlike Dad, would have tried to blend in with their way of living, even to the point of buying a dinghy called a punt by the called a punt by the local Southern Irish folk. It had an outboard 2-horsepower seagull engine and could seat about 6 adults at a push, a theory we put to the test after a particularly inebriated visit to Sherkin Island one night. This particular island is a tiny one, right at the mouth of Baltimore Harbour, and its attraction, apart from having some lovely cliffside walks with magnificent views over the Atlantic Ocean, was a small pub on it that never closed, for the simple reason that there were no garda, meaning policemen, on the little island. According to local folklore, None were ever reported to have gone over there in uniform either, but solely to partake of the local ale with their friends. And no arrests had ever been made, nor had the Sherkin Island pub ever been prosecuted for being open after hours. This, of course, made visits there obligatory, and very late one balmy night, 6 of us, we'd met up with and invited a lift back to the Murphy twins, by the Murphy twins, both young men in their early 20s, whose dad owned the local pub, and both of whom were deeply in love with Francis. We crammed ourselves into the dinghy and, with the sea water occasionally lapping over the gunwales and into the boat, which someone bailed frantically out with a pitted old enamel bowl, we made our precarious and drunken way back to the safety of the wharf. If the sea had been on a strong and outgoing tide, or the wind had decided to strengthen up and whip up a few small waves, we'd have sunk for sure. But being drunk, young, and feeling indestructible, we gave it no thought. None of us ever wore life jackets on the boat, and the old outboard was notoriously temperamental. Henry's passion was fishing for lobsters, and he hired about 6 pots for this purpose. Every morning, Miles and I strolled down to the harbour after a leisurely breakfast and collected some bait in the form of salted mackerel from a big barrel kept behind the small shed with its tarred roof for that purpose. When we first arrived and went down to buy some bait, my uncle was horrified to find that the price of salted mackerel had increased. "This is absolute nonsense," he objected, outraged. "I'll make my own bait." And with that, he bought a splintered old barrel and a huge bag of rough sea salt and set Miles and me to going out into the harbour, as far as we dared, to fish for mackerel using a small square wooden frame of which hung a long line with 7 multicolored feathered hooks attached. We each had one and unravelled the lines, dropping the hooks over the side of the boat, letting them down, each with its feather floating, rippling temptingly into the green depths of the water. It was foolproof. With each cast, we drew in 7 nice, fat, shiny, bluish turquoise Atlantic mackerel, with beautifully black, stripy backs, which flapped and gasped in the bottom of the boat until we knocked them on the head with our priest. We removed the hooks and quickly gutting them, throwing the waste into the water, which attracted a flock of seabirds to our boat. This was enormous fun and took me back to my childhood days, when I'd fished off the side of Grandpa Southey's dinghy on the Neisner Lagoon, or caught trout with Grandpa Fort on the Umgeni River at New Forest. Once we had a decent catch of about a bucketful of mackerel, we chugged back to the wharf, and following Henry's instruction, Miles and I put a layer of salt into the bottom of the barrel, 1 layer of fish, and then another layer of salt, and so on, taking care to pack their cavities well with salt. Henry had dragged his newly acquired barrel, now about 1/8 full of fish and salt, into the shade behind the solitary hut, which was used by all the local Baltimore fishermen to store items they didn't want either wet or blown away in the Atlantic gales in winter. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.